Okay, good afternoon and welcome to the Sustainable Materials Management webinar series, a joint effort between the National Recycling Coalition and the Pennsylvania Recycling Market Center. My name is Wayne Bowen and I'm the program manager for the center and will serve as your moderator today. We would like to extend a special thanks to Bob Hollis of the Mobius Network for providing the webinar management software for this series, and Lisa Ruggiero of the National Recycling Coalition for providing technical support. Today's webinar topic is the Federal Trade Commission's Green Guides. Our presenter today is Julia Solomon-Enser of the FTC. Following her presentation, we will conduct a question and answer session. If you have a question or comment, please use the GoToWebinar dialog box located in the control panel on your screen. You may also use the dialog box to request assistance if you are experiencing technical difficulties during the webinar. Please note that an edited version of this webinar will be made available for viewing via YouTube links on the National Recycling Coalition and Pennsylvania Recycling Market Center websites. And now I'd like to introduce our presenter. Julia Solomon-Enser is an attorney in the Enforcement Division of the Federal Trade Commission's Bureau of Consumer Protection, where she works on a variety of compliance and enforcement matters, including Made in the USA and environmental marketing matters. Prior to joining the FTC in 2010, Ms. Enser was an associate at King & Spalding, LLP in Washington, D.C. Ms. Enser holds a BA from Yale University and a Juris Doctor from the University of Pennsylvania Law School. Okay, I'm going to turn the program over to Julia, and welcome.
Thanks so much, Wayne. I really appreciate it. And thank you all for listening in today. All right. Wayne, if you wouldn't mind advancing to the next slide, please.
Okay, is that up?
Yeah, if you could just advance to the overview slide, please, that'd be great.
Okay, there is a slight delay, Julia, so just when you say next slide, it might take a few seconds.
Okay. All right, well, so as I mentioned, thank you all for having me here today. Just wanted to start by giving you a little bit of overview of the presentation that I'm going to give. So I'm going to start out by providing a little bit of background about the FTC and advertising law generally. And then we'll talk specifically about the 2012 Guides for Environmental Marketing, or as they're called often, the Green Guides. And before I dive in, of course, I have to give the obligatory FTC disclaimer. All the views that I express today are my own and not necessarily the views of the Commission or any individual commissioner. Next slide, please. So first, by way of background, some very general information about the FTC. The FTC is an independent regulatory agency with very broad jurisdiction over almost every sector of the economy. We're the only federal agency with general jurisdiction in the area of consumer protection, and our statutory authority, Section 5 of the FTC Act, declares that unfair or deceptive acts or practices are unlawful. Next slide, please. So the FTC has authority to take action against false or misleading advertising claims. A lot of times you might hear us referred to as the nation's truth in advertising agency. And there are a couple of general principles that underlie the FTC Act. First and foremost, the most important thing to bear in mind is that it tells marketers to tell the truth. And what that means is make sure that you have substantiation for all express and implied claims that you're making. Make sure that you have the evidence to back up consumers' takeaway from your claims, whether that's exactly what you're saying, your express claims, or what you're implying to consumers through the context of your ad. In the context of environmental marketing claims, that substantiation is generally going to be competent and reliable scientific evidence. So what the Green Guides are is they are the Commission's interpretation of the FTC Act in the area of environmental marketing claims. It gives marketers guidance on how to comply with the FTC Act when they're thinking about making environmental marketing claims. Next slide, please. So to ensure that the guides continue to be responsive to today's marketplace, the Commission reviews guides every 10 years. The last review of the Green Guides culminated in the announcement of the final guides in 2012. So in order to ensure a comprehensive review, we took a number of steps. A number of you are probably aware of this and actually participated in the process. We hosted public workshops, we did consumer perception research, we put the proposed guides out for public comment, and then finally issued the revised guides in October of 2012. Next slide, please. A couple of basic principles that underlie the green guides, which are very similar to the principles that I already talked about that underlie the FTC Act generally. The touchstone concept is going to be, how do consumers understand your claims? This is so important. I'm going to return to this throughout my presentation today, because I think this is a misunderstanding that a lot of folks have. The point of the green guides is to prevent consumer deception, not to set environmental policy. We're not an environmental agency. My boss often likes to tell people that we are agnostic when it comes to the environment. Our entire goal is to prevent consumer deception. So the way that we do that is we first have to ask, how do consumers understand your claims? Also want to note that the green guides do apply to all forms of marketing claims. So we're talking business to consumer as well as business to business. Next slide, please. So again, I can't say it too many times, consumer perception controls when it comes to the green guides. How do consumers understand your claims? It doesn't matter how a scientist would understand your claim or how someone else in the environmental field might understand it. The question is, how does the consumer, when they look at your claim in context, understand? And so you might be saying, well, how can I possibly control a consumer's takeaway? What can I do to make sure that my ad conveys exactly what I intend? Well, there are a few things. The more specific your claim is, the less likely it is that a consumer is going to take something away that you don't intend. Also, you need to be careful that you're not overstating the environmental benefit of your product. The example that I like to use is a marketer that says, my product now has twice as much recycled content as it did previously. Well, think of a product where you're going from 1% recycled content to 2%. Yeah, it's literally true that the product has twice as much recycled content, but that claim likely implies to consumers that the environmental benefit is much greater than it is. So the last way that I would emphasize is, when you're making a claim, think about using clear, prominent qualifications that clarify to consumers exactly what you mean by your claim. Next slide, please. As we go along, I want to give you a couple examples of enforcement actions that have taken place in the not too distant past, just so you have some idea of what the FTC is working on and how these principles play out in the litigation context. So there were a series of cases that were announced in February of 2012, referred to as the Windows cases, and these are administrative settlements with Windows manufacturers that were making unsupported energy efficiency and money-saving claims. So we're talking claims like, install these windows and save up to X amount on your electricity bill or whatever. And so this is just an example of a kind of case where the manufacturer was overstating the environmental benefit. We have some independent research that suggests, consumer perception research that suggests that when a consumer looks at an up to claim, the consumer understands that to mean that's the specific benefit that the consumer is receiving. So if it says save up to 50%, the consumer assumes that means that he is going to save 50%, even if, by up to you mean that's the top of the range of the savings. So just an example, don't overstate your environmental benefits. Next slide, please. Qualifications. I want to pause a moment on qualifications to just give you a little bit more information on what we mean by qualifications and how you can make sure that they're helpful to consumers and that they guide consumer understanding in your claims. So make sure that your qualifications are clear and prominent and understandable. What this means is that your qualifications should be in language that a consumer can understand, that the qualification is in sufficiently large type that a consumer can see it, and that the qualification is close to the claim that it's qualifying. Now, at this point, a lot of people often ask me, well, can I qualify my claim by referring to a website? FTC law says that your qualification, so your explanation of what your claim means or your additional information, needs to be right there in close proximity to the claim that's being qualified. So referring to a website is not going to count as being in close proximity to a qualified claim. A little bit later in the presentation, we'll talk about how you can use a website to give more information to consumers, but relying on a website in order to give the qualification to your claim isn't going to do it. Next slide, please. So I want to just give you a list of the specific types of environmental marketing claims that are covered in the Green Guide. So in addition to the general advice on how marketers can avoid making deceptive claims, there's also specific advice on the claims that are listed on this slide. In the interest of time today, I'm not going to go over all of these claims, but just know that this is the universe of what's out there if you encounter one of these claims and are looking for guidance. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start by talking about general environmental benefit claims. So we're talking about claims like green or eco-friendly, environmentally friendly, claims like that. So our consumer perception evidence suggests that when a consumer looks at a general environmental benefit claim, the consumer takes away extremely wide-reaching environmental benefits. So just as an example here, 27% of consumers looked at a claim like green or eco-friendly and understood that to mean that the product had no negative impact on the environment at all. Well, we all know that it's the rare product, if it exists at all, that has no negative impact on the environment at all. So what the guides say is it's highly unlikely that a marketer can substantiate all reasonable interpretations of their general environmental benefit claims. As a side note, a number of consumers also took away specific benefits from the environmental benefit claim, the general claim. So for example, 61% of consumers looked at a general claim and thought that that meant that the product was made with recycled materials. So it's just almost impossible to predict what the consumer is going to take away from a claim that's that broad. So the guides are pretty strong in this area and actually advise marketers not to make unqualified general environmental benefit claims just because the potential consumer takeaways are so broad. Next slide, please. Another enforcement example from 2009. In 2009, we had a case against a company that was marketing bamboo fiber textiles as eco-friendly and having a wide range of environmental benefits. In this case, those specific textiles were actually rayon. They didn't retain the natural attributes of bamboo plants, and the process to transform bamboo to rayon had created a lot, as many of you know, of environmental impacts. So those very broad, unqualified claims deceive consumers for a number of reasons. Next slide, please. So you may be asking, all right, so I can't say, or I'm not supposed to say green or eco-friendly, how can I tout the environmental benefits of my product? Well, in some instances, you might be able to couple that broad claim, green, eco-friendly, with the specific environmental benefit that you're touting. So you might be able to qualify your green claim, for example, by saying green made with recycled content. And this may work if your qualification is clear and prominent. You limit the claim to a specific benefit, like I just said, green recycled content. So you're clearly signaling to consumers what it is about your product that makes it green. And you also need to look at the context of your claim and make sure there are no other deceptive implications that your claim is making. So in some instances, this might require a limited trade-off analysis. So if there's something about your claim that's implying that the product is greener overall than a competitor or greener than a product that doesn't use whatever attribute you're highlighting, make sure that that's true. Again, it goes back to what we talked about at the very beginning. Make sure that you can substantiate all of the consumer's reasonable takeaway from your claim. Next slide, please. So given the widespread use of certifications and seals and their potential for consumer confusion, the final guides included a new section devoted to this subject. There are a couple of points to keep in mind when you're looking at a certification or a logo or a seal. First of all, certifications are endorsements, and that means that there is another commission document that's on point for these claims, and that's the commission's endorsement guides. What the endorsement guides say, in addition to a number of other things, essentially is if there is a material connection between the endorser, so the person awarding the certification, and the person receiving the certification, then that needs to be disclosed to consumers. And we'll talk a minute about what a material connection is. Second, bear in mind that you need substantiation for whatever message is conveyed by the certification, logo, or seal. So again, we're looking at the net impression that the logo is conveying to consumers. In some instances, beware that a logo or a seal might convey a general environmental benefit claim. So for example, if your certification is just called Green Seal and it has a picture of a leaf, we might be back in that troublesome territory we were talking about before. General environmental benefit claim, highly unlikely that you're going to be able to substantiate all of the consumer's reasonable takeaways from that claim. So to avoid any misunderstanding about that, again, think about using clear and prominent qualifications that explain to consumers what your certification means and the particular environmental benefit that it's highlighting. Next slide, please. So I mentioned the endorsement guides and material connections, and want to take a minute to flesh out this concept since a number of you might not be familiar with the endorsement guides. So what the endorsement guides say is essentially a connection between the endorser and the seller of the advertised product that might materially affect the weight or credibility of the endorsement must be disclosed. And so a lot of times we're talking about monetary connections between the endorser and the seller. Sometimes we might be talking about influence that the seller can exert over the standards that the endorser has in place. But I do want to flag for you that the payment of a fee to become certified alone, is not going to constitute a material connection. We know that it costs money to obtain a certification, to get a third party to evaluate your product, and we think that consumers understand that that's a part of the certification process. So that alone would not be a material connection that you would need to disclose. Next slide, please. I want to take a moment to go over an example of a potentially deceptive seal. So the seal on the left on the slide here, the green logo for environmental excellence. Let's imagine that that's a seal that's awarded by a paint company to its own products for low VOC paints. When a consumer looks at that seal, it's highly unlikely that the consumer is going to look at it and understand both that it's a self-certification and that it refers to the fact that the paints have low VOCs. So the consumer's reasonable takeaway is much more likely to be that this is a seal that's awarded by an independent third party with appropriate expertise in evaluating your product, and that the product has far-reaching environmental benefits. The company could probably fix this by including clear and prominent language explaining that the marketer awarded the seal to its own product and that the seal particularly applies to the fact that its paints have low VOCs. And that's, of course, assuming that the marketer can substantiate that claim, of course. Next slide, please. Sometimes this might get a little bit tricky for a certification that covers a very wide range of environmental attributes. A lot of times we get the question, well, yeah, my product is certified by this organization that looks at 80 different attributes. How can I possibly convey to consumers that the particular attribute that they're concerned about is covered in this certification? Well, the guides provide one possible way that you can qualify to explain to consumers that you're using a multi-attribute seal. This isn't the only way to qualify the seal, it's just one possible way that you can do it. And the point of this qualification is to signal to consumers that the particular attribute that the consumer is concerned about. So say I'm particularly concerned about recycled content, that particular attribute may or may not be considered in the certification. And then for details on whether the particular attribute that the consumer cares about was covered in this cert, then the consumer can go to the website for more information. So you may ask, how does this square with the guidance that we talked about before, that marketers shouldn't qualify their claims with references to a website? Well, what I would point out to you with this particular example is the important qualification we're looking at here to the consumer. The important signal is the particular attribute you care about might not be considered in this certification. That's the operative qualification, is that signal to consumer. This certification doesn't cover the entire range of possible environmental attributes in the entire world. The reference to the website is a way to include more information if the consumer is really concerned about diving into the specifics of the standard to really understand what is covered by the certification. Next slide, please. Another enforcement example, and this is of a environmental seal that the FTC challenged in 2011. So Tested Green was a company that sold environmental certifications. In fact, that's all they did, was sell environmental certifications. Consumers or marketers paid a fee to Tested Green, and then Tested Green turned around and said, congratulations, you've been Tested Green, you're certified. In fact, the FTC got certified by Tested Green. So just an example of a certification company that didn't have anything backing up its cert. Interesting thing to look at if you're thinking about getting one of your products certified. Next slide, please. I'm going to take a few moments now to talk about a few particular claims that are covered by the guides that I think might be of interest to our audience today. So first of all, I'm just going to mention, and I'm going to go through these fairly quickly because I want to make sure that we have lots of time to answer all of your questions. So I'll start with compostable claims. The main thing to keep in mind with compostable claims is that you should make sure to qualify your claim in a number of instances. First of all, if your product cannot be composted in home compost, you need to qualify to explain that to consumers. We have consumer perception evidence that suggests that when consumers look at compostable claims, they think that means they can throw it on their home compost pile and compost it that way. If that's not true, you need to qualify. Second, qualify if your claim misleads about the environmental benefit if the item is disposed in a landfill. And third, qualify if composting facilities or proper facilities to compost your product are not available to a substantial majority of consumers. Next slide, please. So degradable claims. Again, this is a claim that is going to, in a lot of instances, require some qualification. And what the guides say is qualify your claim unless the entire item will completely break down and return to nature within a reasonably short period of time after customary disposal. And the guides are specific on this point, that the reasonably short period of time after customary disposal is 1 year for items entering the solid waste stream. Obviously, this is a problem for many items that are typically disposed of in a landfill. As many of you know, conditions in many landfills are not such that most products are going to degrade in a year. So pretty important in most instances to qualify these claims. On the left, you'll just see a cite to another enforcement example that you may want to look at if you're thinking about making claims in this area. Next slide, please. A new section added to the guides in 2012 is a section dedicated to free of claims. So we're talking about things like chlorine-free, claims like that. And what the guides say in this area is that a truthful free of claim can still be deceptive in two instances. First, if the product contains a substance that still poses the same or a similar risk. And second, if the substance was never associated with the product to begin with. So for example, if you're making a claim like t-shirts bleached using a chlorine-free process, and it's literally true that you don't use chlorine in the process of bleaching your t-shirts, but you use a different chemical or a different process that causes the same harm to the environment that chlorine causes, that claim may still deceive consumers. And then for the second one, if you say something like chlorine-free and chlorine was never associated with your product to begin with, if you're trying to imply, for example, that your competitor is using some environmentally damaging process or something, and that's not true, that claim can deceive consumers. Now, interestingly, the guides also say that in some cases, you may be able to make a truthful free of claim even though your product contains a trace amount of the substance if, and this is a new 3-part test, there's no more than a trace contaminant or background level of the substance. The substance won't cause material harm typically associated with that substance. And I think this is the most important prong of this test, the substance was not intentionally added. So just something to keep in mind. Next slide, please. A few enforcement examples in this area. In 2013, the FTC announced 2 administrative settlements with paint companies that were making VOC-free claims for their paints. In this case, the problem was that both of these companies were marketing base paints that were VOC-free or low VOC, but then the way that consumers typically buy paints is they have tints injected into the base paints to create the colors that the consumers are looking for. The problem was that in a number of cases, those tints actually really increased the VOC level of the paints. So when the consumers walked out the door with their gallon of VOC-free paint, after it had been tinted, it wasn't VOC-free or low VOC at all. So the orders for these cases incorporate that new trace test that I just talked about. Next slide, please. Similarly, there were a number of settlements in late 2013 with mattress companies that were making no VOC claims. Again, the thing to keep in mind here is that these orders incorporate that trace amount test, so something to look at if you're making VOC-free claims or any free of claims. There's also a seal issue in the Eco Baby case, so just something to flag for you. Next slide, please. I want to briefly mention non-toxic claims. The thing to bear in mind with a non-toxic claim is that our consumer perception research suggests that consumer takeaways from unqualified non-toxic claims are extremely broad. Consumers look at those claims and think that they mean the item is not toxic either for humans or for the environment. So we're talking everything down to tiny marine life. It's very, very difficult claim for a marketer to substantiate. So in most instances, I would recommend that the marketer think about qualifying their non-toxic claim. Next slide, please. So maybe this slide is maybe at the heart of what you guys are interested in today, but the guidance for making recyclable claims didn't change all that much in the 2012 guides. The touchstone for a recyclable claim is who has access to a recycling facility. That's really the most important question to ask when you're thinking about making a claim for your product. If a substantial majority of consumers or communities has access to a facility that will accept and process the material, then no qualification is necessary to make a non-deceptive claim. So you can just say recyclable for that product. If, however, less than a substantial majority, and the guide specifically defines substantial majority as 60%, then the marketer, if less than 60% has access, then the marketer needs to qualify the claim. There are a couple of ways that a marketer can qualify a recyclable claim for a product for which less than a substantial majority of consumers have access to recycling facilities. Of course, you can always state the exact percentage of consumers or communities that can access facilities that process the material, but that can be really difficult. That's kind of a moving target. So another way to qualify is on a sliding scale. And what that means is the closer you are to a substantial majority of consumers or communities having access, the weaker your qualification can be, because almost a substantial majority has access. The fewer the number is of consumers or communities that has access, the stronger the qualification needs to be. So just another point that I want to make, it's not on the slide, but I want to just briefly mention, if your item is only partially recyclable, make sure you qualify with information about what is recyclable. And if there's something about the shape of your product that makes it not recyclable or changes the recyclability of the product, then you'll need to analyze the percentage of consumers or communities that has access to facilities that will actually accept and process your product in the shape that it is, or in whatever form that it takes. Next slide, please. So recycled content, couple of points to make here. The basic premise for making a recycled content claim is, was the product diverted from the waste stream? Obviously, this is a fairly easy inquiry for post-consumer materials. It gets a lot more difficult for pre-consumer materials. And the guides, unfortunately, are not terribly specific about what constitutes pre-consumer recycled content. What the guides do say is a minimal reprocessing of scraps that are normally reused within the original manufacturing process is not going to constitute pre-consumer recycled content. So this is an area of kind of active work at the FTC. We're still always soliciting consumer perception evidence on how consumers understand claims for pre-consumer recycled content. So if that's something you have, of course, we're always interested to see it, always interested in looking at these claims. It's a difficult area. Next slide, please. So I'm going to breeze through these slides pretty quickly, but just so you know, there's guidance on renewable energy. Make sure that you don't make unqualified claims unless all or virtually all of the significant manufacturing processes are powered with recycled energy, or you're replacing or matching all of the energy you're using from fossil fuels with RECs. So you can minimize consumer deception in this area by specifying the source of your renewable energy, so whether it's solar or wind or whatever. And just bear in mind that making a hosting claim implies use to many consumers. One way to clarify to consumers that you host a renewable energy source or facility but don't necessarily use it is you can say something like, we generate renewable energy but sell all of it to others. Next slide, please. Renewable materials is just another area that we found with a lot of consumer deception, or not deception, I'm sorry, but a lot of misunderstanding among consumers. Consumers don't really get what renewable materials mean. 53% of consumers that were surveyed looked at a renewable materials claim and thought that that meant that the product was recyclable. So consumer understanding is just all over the place for renewable materials claims. You can avoid consumer misperception of your claims by providing context, by explaining what materials you used, what it is about that material that makes it renewable, and by qualifying if your entire product is not made with renewable materials. And so there's just an example of this over on the right underneath the picture of the bamboo. It says made with fast-growing bamboo, which grows at the same rate or faster than we use it. Next slide, please. So finally, just want to highlight 3 areas where there's no guidance in the 2012 Green Guide, and that's sustainable, organic, and natural. There are various reasons for why there's no guidance in those areas, and we can talk about that. if that's something that's of interest to you. But I just want to flag that those are areas where there is no guidance, although the general principles that underlie the Green Guides and Section 5 of the FTC Act, of course, both apply to manufacturers making these claims. And last slide, please. So that concludes my presentation today. If you are looking for more information, here is a link to the portion of our website that provides information on the Green Guides. You're also welcome to contact me. My email address is just my first initial and my last name, so jensor@ftc.gov. Always happy to talk to anyone. And with that, we can open it up for questions.
All right, thank you, Julia, for that excellent presentation. We are now going to field some questions for Julia. Again, if you have a question, please enter them on the GoToWebinar dialog box. So I'm going to go to the question section here and see what we have. Okay, this one has to do with the "so close" essentially means on the label, not in some small type package insert.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So you're asking, the question is, what does close proximity mean for qualification?
Right.
Yeah. So in general, that is going to mean on the label, on the product packaging. It's going to mean that your qualification is very close to the claim that you're qualifying. So, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to write a treatise on exactly what your claim means. It just means that to the extent that your claim requires qualification, it needs to be near enough to the claim, your qualification needs to be near enough to the claim that's being qualified that consumers see it and read it along with the claim. The qualification isn't of much use if it's completely unnoticeable to a consumer.
Does FTC have a list of the so-called certifying agencies, a description of each and their veracity, especially as third party, and is this list public if it exists?
The FTC is not in the business of approving particular certifiers or endorsing particular certifiers, so we don't maintain any particular list of certifiers that we would accord greater weight than any other certifiers. So no, we don't have that.
Okay. What does the "return to nature" phrase mean in the degradable definition?
Well, that's a pretty specific question. So my understanding, and degradable is not my particular area of expertise, but my understanding is that return to nature means that it will decompose into the other materials that it's degrading alongside, that it will decompose into pieces and return essentially to dirt. But I can, if you want to contact me offline, whoever asked that question, I can put you in touch particularly with our degradable expert who can provide a lot more detail about all of those definitions and what's meant by the specifics.
This question has to do with the 60% and recyclable applied, and what does that mean in the geographic area or geographic radius?
Right. So that's a tough question. When we're talking about consumer access, that can really vary depending on the particular community that we're talking about. So the Green Guides have an example here that talks a little bit and shows how fluctuation of community and the definition of community can occur depending on the particular area that we're talking about. And I would refer you to the FTC Statement of Basis and Purpose for its Green Guides, which is a really useful document for those of you that haven't seen it. That's on the website with the Green Guides. It explains the Commission's reasoning for changes to the guides and analysis of the comments. But essentially what that example does on page 173 is it talks about a PET bottle manufacturer that's trying to figure out whether a town is a community with access or not, and it describes a town with no curbside collection or drop-off program within city limits. But it has a PET drop-off facility en route to the city where most of that town's residents work, do their shopping, and attend entertainment events. And so in that particular circumstance, even though the residents of that town don't have access to curbside recycling and they might have to drive some to the drop-off, because they would do that during the course of their everyday life, that could be an example of a wider geographic reach for access, just because it's within the habits of that particular community. So it can really vary. Unfortunately, there's no extremely concrete guidance on how to calculate that 60% number. The statement of basis and purpose does point to AF&PA's 2010 community survey and the American Beverage Association's 2008 community survey as examples of databases of communities that those organizations develop based on U.S. Census Bureau data. So that's one possible approach, not the only approach. Something you might want to look at for guidance on calculating that 60% figure.
Okay, I'm not sure if you can answer this question, but they ask, can you give an example of some legitimate pre-consumer waste that the FTC has vetted?
Unfortunately, that's not a question I'm going to be able to answer today.
Okay. Is there a mechanism for us to follow up on the status of claims we have reported to the FTC as suspected green guide violations?
So the existence or non-existence of all investigations here at the FTC is non-public information. So unfortunately, although we are always delighted to receive your complaints and information that any of you have, we're not able to provide updates on the status of investigations or particular complaints.
Okay, here's an example. What about a claim that does not distinguish post-consumer or pre-consumer? Example, I have a pen that says it's made of 80% recycled bottles, but doesn't say if it's pre or post. This vagueness is prevalent in office supplies and some building material categories. So
there's no requirement in the guides for marketers to distinguish between pre-consumer or post-consumer recycled content. The requirement is just for the marketers to be able to substantiate that the product has the amount of recycled content that the marketer is claiming. The guides do say if you do choose to distinguish between pre and post-consumer content, that you need to make sure that you have substantiation for your claims, that you're making truthful claims, but there's no requirement that marketers need to disclose or differentiate.
Okay, this question asks about the term organic. Is this term regulated by the USDA?
So the USDA does have some jurisdiction over organic claims, particularly, of course, for agricultural products. So that's actually one of the reasons that the FTC didn't issue guidance in this area, is because of USDA's jurisdiction over organic claims for agricultural products. But for products outside of USDA's jurisdiction, the FTC may be able to bring actions against deceptive claims that would violate the FTC Act.
Okay, this question isn't on the topic, but I'd be interested in it too. Your work on Made in the USA, can you maybe provide a little bit of information on that?
Sure. I am the primary staff member charged with working with companies that want to make truthful U.S. origin or made in the USA claims. We have an enforcement policy statement on U.S. origin claims that provides guidance in that area. I'm always happy to talk to marketers that want to make truthful made in the USA, U.S. origin claims. It's a particular area where we do a lot of counseling and want to help people get it right, because we think it's really important that marketers are able to tout their truthful U.S. manufacturing functions. But on the other hand, of course, we always have to work to prevent consumer deception. So it is a particular area where we're interested in counseling folks. So if you have questions in that area, please reach out.
Okay, thank you. This question is, I guess, a technical question. Is there a difference between the term biodegradable and degradable?
So that would, again, you're hitting on the area that's really outside of my expertise, unfortunately. But so the FTC doesn't define terms. We look at consumer understanding of terms. Degradable and biodegradable are lumped together in the guidance in the green guides. I haven't drilled down to whether consumers understand biodegradable and degradable differently. I'm not sure. It would be interesting to know. So again, if that individual wants to contact me offline and wants to discuss degradable claims at greater length with our degradable expert, I'm happy to put you in touch.
What are the consequences of misrepresentation of green labeling? So I guess what they're saying is if the FTC goes after a company, what can they expect as far as pursuing the case?
Well, there are a number of different routes that we could proceed. The FTC might in some instances work with the company to help them remediate their claim, or we might bring enforcement action under the FTC Act. We could do that either in federal court or administratively in an administrative court here within the agency. And how that case proceeds, it really depends, case-by-case inquiry. There are a lot of people ask, is there a fine or would I be subject to a fine? FTC Act doesn't provide for civil penalties on the first instance, but if a company were to come under order from the FTC and then violate that order, then that could lead to civil penalties. But each case is really going to take its own course. It really depends on the facts of the case. But I would encourage folks that are really interested in enforcement to take a look at some of the examples that I provided in my presentation today.
Has the FTC considered developing guidelines for what zero waste or zero waste to landfill means?
To my knowledge, this has not been an area that we've studied. It was not an area that we looked at in our consumer perception study.
Okay. Can you explain the use of the websites again? What about using, for example, www.findacomposter.com to qualify the lack of access for a compostable item?
As long as you qualify your claim to signal to consumers that consumers might not have access to a composting facility that will compost your product, as long as you provide the other qualifications that are necessary to make sure that your consumers aren't being deceived by your claim, it's always fine to refer to a website for additional information. The problem comes not just from referring to a website. The problem is when a marketer relies on a website for its qualification. So if the marketer just says compostable, see www.myproduct.com with no further information. The problem is that consumer at the point of purchase, a lot of consumers aren't going to be able to go to the website and see what your qualification is. So if your qualification is this product is not compostable in your home pile, then you need to make sure that that is actually on the face of your product, that is in close proximity to the compostable claim. If you also want to provide more additional information and say, hey, also check out this website for more information, that's fine. It's just you need to make sure that the qualification that makes your claim truthful and provides the information that consumers need is right there.
Okay,
does that help?
Here's a practical question. How do you report an alleged false claim?
So there are a number of ways to let us know about complaints or to provide information to the FTC. There's a spot on our website at ftc.gov for you to make complaints. That's a good way to get complaints to us. There's also a hotline where folks are standing by to take your complaints, and the phone number for that is 1-877-FTC-HELP, 1-877-382-4357. So that's a way to get complaints to us. You can always also email me or others here at the division directly and provide information. That's also an option.
Okay, I'm doing some screening here. Give me a second. Okay, while I'm screening, could you give them your email address again, Julia?
Yep, it's just my first initial and my last name, JENSOR at ftc.gov.
I don't know if you entered this before, but where can you find the guidelines for sustainable claims? You know, the green guides, I guess, on your website.
So there is no guidance on sustainable claims in the green guide. So that's not something that you're going to find in the green guides. If you're interested in reading a little bit about why there is no guidance about sustainable claims, that's something that you can find in the statement of basis and purpose that I mentioned, and that's available on that website that we flashed up as the last slide of the presentation. So business.ftc.gov. Yeah, there it is. It's probably easier than me reading it. But you should be able to find it there. If you have trouble, just let me know and I can shoot you a copy.
Okay, well, one more question here. When will the green guides be updated?
So as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, the guides are on a 10-year review cycle. So that would be the schedule is 10 years, I guess, from 2012. So, but of course, if we receive consumer perception evidence that shows that the guides are wrong and that they need to be changed or we need to revisit something in the interim, then that is always an option for us.
Okay, great. Well, that was a great list of questions from the audience, and I thank you for providing those questions. And thank you again, Julia, for the great presentation and answering the questions. Again, this webinar, like all the webinars in this series, has been recorded and will be made available via YouTube links on both the National Recycling Coalition and Recycling Market Center websites. And thank you again for joining us. We hope you'll join us for next month's webinar scheduled for August 19th. Please visit the NRC and RMC websites for schedule and topic content updates. And again, thank you, Julia, and have a great day to everyone who's participated.
Thank you all. Bye.